Hey, how's it going? My name is Wes. Welcome back to another lesson. In today's lesson, we have another yellow lesson, and usually the yellow lessons are verb lessons. However, in today's lesson, of course, we also have a verb lesson, but this time, instead of learning a new verb, we will look at auxiliary verbs in Spanish. So today's lesson, auxiliary verbs in Spanish. Let's get into it. Alright, so before we dive into what auxiliary verbs are, let's first have a recap of all of the verbs that we have learned so far. So, we learned 7 verbs in total. We learned to want,
querer,
to have,
tener,
to be as a characteristic,
ser,
to be as a state,
estar,
to can or to be able to
poder,
go,
ir,
and the verb hacer, which was to do or to make.
hacer.
Right, so those are the 7 verbs that we have learned so far. Now, with these verbs that we have learned, we can now start to make sentences because we learned all of the different conjugations. So for example, in this sentence, I want a coffee. We can use the verb querer, which was to want, and we can conjugate it into the correct form. So yo quiero un café. I want a coffee.
Yo quiero un café. Yo quiero un café.
Or for example, in this sentence, I have a car. We use the verb tener, which was to have. And then of course we need to conjugate it into the I form. So yo tengo un coche. Yo tengo un coche. I have a car.
Yo tengo un coche. Yo tengo un coche.
And then one more example. So for example, if we want to say I am American, then we are talking about a characteristic. So we use the verb ser. And then, of course, if we conjugate that to the I form, then we say yo soy. So yo soy americano. I am American.
Yo soy americano. Yo soy americano.
So in these 3 examples that we just went over, we use a single verb. So just one verb in the whole sentence. So yo quiero un café, yo tengo un coche, and yo soy americano. We just use one verb. So I want, I have, and I am. However, sometimes when we create sentences, we might want to use more than one verb. So for example, in this sentence, I want to go to the beach, in which we use 2 different verbs. We use to want and also to go.
Yo quiero ir a la playa.
Instead of using one verb, we now use 2 verbs. So to want and to go, which are 2 different verbs right next to each other. So I want to go to the beach in Spanish is
Yo quiero ir a la playa. Yo quiero ir a la playa.
And in this example, I made one verb yellow and one verb bold so that you can spot the differences so that it's not all yellow. So to want and to go. And just to give you one more example of a sentence in which we have multiple verbs, so 2 verbs for example.
Yo puedo hacer una lista.
I can make a list. So here again we have 2 verbs, poder, so yo puedo, and hacer, so to can or to be able to, poder, and hacer, to do or to make.
Yo puedo hacer una lista. Yo puedo hacer una lista.
So in these 2 examples, we see that just like as we do in the English language, in the Spanish language, we can also add or stack multiple verbs next to each other to create a sentence. And as you can probably see, the first verb is almost like a helper or a supporting verb to the second one. So yo puedo hacer. So puedo in this example is almost like a helper verb that helps out the other verb. So puedo hacer or quiero ir. And in Spanish, we refer to this type of verb, or we call this type of verb an auxiliary verb. So an auxiliary verb is a verb that in a sentence helps out another verb. So from now on, every time you hear me talk about an auxiliary verb, so when we go over a new verb and I tell you this verb is an auxiliary verb, then from now on you understand that, okay, so this verb is usually used in combination with another verb and it's being used to help or support that other verb. So auxiliary verbs are verbs that support or help another verb. Hey, what's up? It's Wes from the future. I'm sorry to interrupt this video. I just wanted to let you know that I also have a Patreon, where you can get early access to the next video lessons. All you have to do is to click on the link in the description, which will take you to my Patreon page where you can sign up for early access to the next lessons. Because here on YouTube, I only upload one new video every week. So if you don't want to wait for a new lesson to appear and you already want to watch all of the new lessons, then you can do so by going to my Patreon. And if you prefer YouTube over Patreon, that's also possible. Simply go to my YouTube channel and click on the join button to gain early access to the next lessons. Your support helps me to keep making more videos for free for anybody to watch, and the goal is to make many more courses in different languages, so I could really use your help. Alright, that's it for this short interruption. I'm sorry, let's get back to the video. Alright, let's move on. So, what I think is important for you to know is, for example, some common auxiliary verbs in Spanish. And what you might see is that we have actually went over most of these verbs. And that is because in this whole course, I selected 15 verbs that I wanted to take a deep look into, or that I wanted to dive deep into. Because the thing is, the Spanish language consists of thousands of verbs. So you might ask yourself, Wes, why do we look at specifically these 15 verbs? And what I tried to do is to be very careful with verbs that I selected. And so I tried to select the most important ones for the Spanish language. Because I believe that learning these 15 words by heart is very essential to becoming fluent in Spanish. So what I pretty much want to say is that I really took a lot of time and was very careful with selecting whatever I wanted to include and what not to include in this whole course. Anyways, that's maybe a bit off topic, but some common auxiliary verbs in Spanish are
haber, estar, ser, ir, poder.
And we already saw some of those in the examples. Yo quiero ir a la playa, or yo puedo hacer una lista. So that's pretty much what I wanted to explain to you in this lesson about auxiliary verbs. However, there is one more thing that we need to go over before we end this lesson. Because one more thing that we need to know about auxiliary verbs, and I know I'm getting a bit technical here, but when you use an auxiliary verb in combination with another verb, so you have two verbs in one sentence, then usually the first verb in a sentence, which is the auxiliary verb, that verb usually conjugates or changes depending on who it is you're talking about. But the second verb, and this is very important to understand, the second verb is usually unchanged, or in its infinitive form as we call it. So to give you an example of what that means, if you look at this example sentence, which is
Ellos quieren ir a la playa. Ellos quieren ir a la playa.
Which is they want to go to the beach. Ellos quieren ir. So they want to go. Then you see here that because we use ellos, the verb querer conjugates into quieren, because we are talking about ellos, so ellos quieren. But then if we look at the second verb, so the verb ir, it doesn't actually conjugate. So even though we are saying ellos, the verb ir doesn't conjugate or doesn't change at all. It's in its infinitive or like original form. And the same thing happens in this sentence.
Tú puedes hacer una lista. Tú puedes hacer una lista.
So we are now talking about you. So tú puedes. And puedes is a conjugation of the verb poder. So tú puedes. But then as you can see, the verb hacer remains unchanged. So it actually doesn't change to haces because we are talking about tú. And that is because puedes already is conjugated. So we already know that we are talking about tú. So there's not really a need to also conjugate that verb hacer, because the verb poder, that first verb, that auxiliary verb, has already been conjugated. I hope I'm making sense here. Actually, look at one more example.
Él quiere ser fuerte. Él quiere ser fuerte.
He wants to be strong. So again, in this sentence, we have two different verbs. We have querer and ser. So to want and to be. So because we are talking about él, so he, we conjugate the first verb, the auxiliary verb, and we turn it into quiere. So él quiere. And then the second verb, to be, ser, remains unchanged. So él quiere ser fuerte. He wants to be strong. So as a recap, what we saw is that an auxiliary verb is a verb that helps another verb. And we also learned that usually when we use two different verbs in one sentence, so we use an auxiliary verb and a normal verb, then the first verb or the auxiliary verb in a sentence changes or conjugates, and the second verb usually does not conjugate, and so it remains its original form, or as we call this in grammatical terms, it remains in its infinitive form. So that's it for this lesson in which we learned the auxiliary verbs in Spanish. By now, I hope that you understand what an auxiliary verb is and how we use it in the Spanish language. As always, for an overview of today's lesson, you can go to my website, SpanishWithWes.com, where you can find the material of any of the lessons we went over. Alright, that's it for this lesson. Again, thank you so much for watching. I hope that it was helpful. And as always, I hope to see you in the next video. Adios.